Hey everyone, we had a few technical difficulties there, but we're back. So welcome to the second edition of Competency Corner Live. My name is Sarah Beckett. I am the host of this monthly Q&A show. I am very excited to be able to introduce this month Dr. Andrea Butler, who's here from Toronto. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks for having me.
So as I mentioned, Andrea is here from our offices in Toronto. Yes, HRSG does have an office in Toronto. And Andrea and our other colleagues are down for our holiday party tonight, hence the hat. So it's going to be a good time. We're all excited for the party tonight, so, you know, going to have a good time.
I hope so.
So how are you finding the weather here in Ottawa, Andrea? It's pretty cold, eh?
Pretty cold, lots of snow. Could do without that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was about -20 this morning here in Ottawa. Very cold.
Or -5 for those of you in Fahrenheit.
Doesn't matter, it's all cold. So we're going to jump right into our questions. We have got a few questions submitted to us in advance, so that's great. So this first question came to us from Mark. So Mark asks, I'm investigating whether or not competencies can be used to improve performance of my sales team. Can you comment on that, Andrea?
That's a great question. Thanks for that, Mark. So absolutely. So when you think about performance, we often think about what a person does. So, you know, maybe that's I have to go out and sell so many widgets this month or so many upsells. But that's only part of the picture. What else do you think they would need from a sales perspective?
Well, things like client focus, you know, good listening, interactive communication skills, things like that, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the competencies, the how you go about doing something. So you need to look at both if you're really getting a full picture of what is needed for success. So if you're missing that piece, you're not really knowing if that person has all the skills they need to be successful.
Great. And so, Andrea, you work with a lot of our smaller clients here at HRSG, the smaller projects, people often getting started with competencies. And I think a lot of them do actually start out with their sales groups. Is there a reason behind this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we would usually recommend, if you're starting a project like one of these, start with a pilot group so you can really work out what's working, work out your communication strategy. Absolutely. And a lot of people do start with sales, and one of the reasons being certainly it is a common, you know, function that a lot of companies have. For instance, we even have a very large, very well-developed sales library of competencies to draw upon. So it is really a good group often to start with.
And somewhere you can probably demonstrate some quick wins.
Absolutely, and that's why you do want a pilot, is to show that, you know, this is having an effect, so then you can make those changes and roll it out across your organization.
Absolutely. So we're going to go on to the next question here. This comes to us from Amy. This is another one that was submitted in advance, so thank you very much, Amy, for sending this in. Andrea, do you have any tips on how to measure the effectiveness of competencies?
Oh, well, thanks for that question, Amy. Absolutely. I mean, you can use what you already have in place. So part of that should start in the planning phase. So you've got to think about what you're going to measure so you can start having a baseline. So you can look at it before you start using competencies and after. So for example, if you've got an engagement survey already in place, maybe you're already measuring job satisfaction, turnover, things of those natures, those would be good measures. Because the great thing about competencies now is you're taking goals and giving them definition for every employee across the organization in terms of what success looks like. So now I've got a clear understanding of what I'm supposed to do, so I should be more satisfied in my job, and turnover should go down. So those are some examples. Even if you're more in a client-facing organization, you could look at your client satisfaction data, some of those great measures. Some other simple ones might be, you know, maybe you only had 10% of your people had learning and development plans in place.
Yeah, that's right.
And now you got 90 down the road. So that in itself is like a huge win. Something small, but so powerful.
For sure. So I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned was turnover. So that we actually did another event, a webinar last week, and we had a client of ours from Rocky Mountain Equipment, and he was talking about turnover was their big issue. So that, you know, that's what they measured before. And a year after the project was started, rolled out, competencies were rolled out in the organization, they were able to cut their turnover by 10%. I mean, that I think they suffer from a larger turnover, so it's still, you know, they still have a lot of work to do in they have an amazing team and they're really working towards this. But cutting it by 10%, I mean, that's
big.
amazing.
That's huge. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's definitely powerful measurements you can use, and even some commonly overlooked ones would be just simply go out to your employees and managers that are using these competencies.
Sure.
Ask them, how are these competencies making their lives better as an employee? That in itself too is going to give you some really rich information.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, so we are starting to get some other questions coming in now. So this one, look at this here. This is coming to us from Esther. Thank you very much, Esther, for submitting the question. This is about core competencies. It's a two-part question. So we're going to start. What is the difference between an organization's values and core competencies?
Oh, that's a great question. We do get asked that one a lot.
We do.
So values are really those guiding principles or standards that the organization would like their employees to basically follow. Now, when we're talking about core competencies, that's taking that to another level. We're now saying, what are the observable behaviors that we can look at to capture those values, the missions, the things that define that organization's success? And the nice thing about these core competencies is you're saying from the bottom up to the top, these are the behaviors that everybody needs to demonstrate if we're going to work towards achieving those goals and be successful as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I always use examples for things. So if I put it in context, HRSG, our own company, we have a professional services arm, part that Andrea is part of the TMS, the Talent Management Solutions group, and we also have our software group, again, a very client-facing group. One of our clients are our lifeblood, and one of our core competencies is obviously client focus. So it's just another tangible way to really communicate that to employees.
Right, and again, as I said, it's about the whole organization as a whole. In marketing, for instance, in your role, you're maybe not as client-facing, but that doesn't mean you're not dealing with the rest of us within HRSG, and we're your internal clients. So you have to really focus on building those relationships, meeting our needs. Again, if we're going to be successful as an organization.
Absolutely. So the second part of this, and we kind of touched on it a little bit here, is do you have any recommendations on communicating core competencies to employees across the organization?
Oh, okay, that's a good one. Thanks for that. Absolutely. Again, you can keep it simple. You could use emails, you can use video, but a large part of that is starting with a communication plan. And again, that should come early in your process. And part of that plan would be identifying, who you're going to communicate with. Is that managers, employees? Because you could have different audiences.
Right.
What key messages do you need to deliver to those folks? Because again, that may vary as well. And then what medium are you going to use? So again, as I mentioned, there are a number of options from videos to emails to the company's server. You can go crazy and brand things from mouse pads to posters to the floor as you're walking into the front part of the building. I even saw one of our clients had a really creative solution where they created a workbook that really looked at the core competencies and some critical examples of actual employees who engaged
That's really cool.
in those examples. So they were trying to recognize and point out, these are things we want you to do.
Great. Well, that's awesome. Okay. So we don't have a ton of time here, so we've got some questions coming in. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which comes to us from Zoe. Thank you very much, Zoe, for submitting that. So what are some of the common outcomes of using competencies?
Well, thanks for your question, Zoe. Certainly, competencies, because you're using them for a variety of different HR applications, they can have a large range of effects. So if we start talking about hiring, if you're looking at core competencies now, you can start having a way to look at culture fit, as you talked about in the webinar earlier this week. You can start making sure you're matching people to that specific job. If you start looking at technical competencies, you can start using them, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a great language for saying this is what's needed for success. If I know my job, I know my career path, it's going to make me more engaged. So it's going to help from that learning and development standpoint. Even from an organizational standpoint, now you know where your competency gaps are, you know what your strengths are, so you can use that knowledge to kind of plan for, what requirements and jobs you're going to need. So pretty much, competencies are like that glue, that middle, that, they're the building block that links all of your talent management cycles.
For sure. Great. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, so our next question here comes to us. Keep them coming, guys. This is great. Please send in those questions. So this comes to us from Ghassan. This is interesting. So my team has been debating internally whether or not we need to do an internal review of our competencies. We hear this all the time from our clients. So do you have any thoughts on this, Andrea? Do competencies change?
That's an interesting one. I would say if you think about behavioral competencies or those more soft skills, when you think about what makes somebody adaptable, that's probably not going to change over time. But when you start to look at those more technical or functional based competencies, then that's where you might see some changes as the nature of work changes. So take, for example, marketing. What would be some of the key trends you've seen maybe in the last 5 years?
Anything digital right now. Digital and the data analytics is another absolutely huge area.
Absolutely. So those are areas certainly in marketing where you're going to see now more need for competencies around those types of knowledge and expertise. Even within, say, project management, we tend to see a lot more need for, say, agile product management. So,
absolutely.
So again, as the nature of work changes, some of those critical technical competencies may change as well. So you might need to either build new competencies, which, I mean, in our marketing group, we did recently just develop a whole library of digital competencies because that is now a new need. So again, yeah, absolutely. As work changes, some of those technical competencies may change as well.
And I think there's also an element of, although the competencies themselves may not change, organizations change. So as from the general competency point of view, if you're going through a growth period or vice versa, you're going through an attrition period, there are certain requirements that employees will need to have, certain behavioral characteristics that they will need to have in order to help the organization achieve a particular set of goals, whatever those may be. So, again, I think that's something that I'm sure you see a lot with your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as we were talking about core competencies, again, that's really allowing the organization to achieve their goals. So if you're in a big period of change, those core competencies might be ones that you want to define to allow you to reach that change. Because again, they're defined for everybody from the bottom of the organization to the top.
For sure. Okay, so this is a good one. Again, something we hear very often from clients. This comes to us from Brecken. How small is too small to use competencies?
Simple answer, size doesn't matter in this case. Competencies, as we've been talking about, one of the really main advantages is really you're creating that common language, that common understanding of what success looks like. So if I've got 10 employees to 10,000s of employees, it doesn't really matter. You're still going to see it as a very powerful tool that, again, links all of your talent management initiatives.
For sure. And there's probably a degree of sophistication that may come with the larger organizations. In a smaller organization, maybe you just want to use core competencies.
That's right.
And start there. Just, having those powerful tools to be able to use as communication vehicles within an organization to set the tone for, these are the goals we want to achieve as an organization, and these are the behaviors that will help you, employee A, B, C, D, help us, collectively achieve those goals.
Exactly, and that's why a lot of people will start with core competencies, because they do affect everyone, so it's a great place to start as you're looking to dip your toe into the competency management waters.
Cool, that's great. Okay, so we've got another question here from Andrew. As a member of a digital team, how can we use competencies in decentralized locations?
That's a great question. Certainly, I would say technology is becoming a tool to really manage, I would say, your competency content. So even if you've got a competency that's looking at whatever the digital aspect of your job is, if everyone has access to that, and if you've got, much like our competencies, multi-level competencies, you can really describe what the progression of behaviors looks like for different jobs. So again, it's allowing you for career pathing and other types of uses.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So here's a cool question. How can startups benefit from competency? So this kind of goes back to the previous one, and I'll tell a little story about this after, but go ahead.
Again, I would say startups is about thinking about, all companies are starting new, they've got visions, values, or where they want to go in terms of, whatever their industry is in. So core competencies are probably a great place to start there, because again, they're going to affect all, as we've been talking about, everybody across the organization. So that, I would say, is a great place to think about. Also, as you start to organize your jobs, you might then start looking at, maybe what are job families that could be related to those jobs. Because when you start to get at a finer layer of competencies, it's nice to know that, these jobs all have something in common, and starting to build down as you go and get into a finer level of detail.
Yeah. So a couple of months ago, I don't know when it was exactly, but I was at the Startup Canada event here in town. So this was an awesome event. So shout out to all the organizers there. It was really, really great. Met some amazing people, some brilliant people. These young, entrepreneurs starting these companies. It was just brilliant. But in talking to a lot of people, one of their big concerns was around scaling. So as they grow, so first of all, taking a risk on a new employee when you're going through that growth mode is a big risk, because you can't afford as a small business owner to bring somebody in who's not going to add value, who's not going to be able to, be incredibly agile, moving from, project A to B to C, all in, potentially the span of a couple of hours. Wear a number of different hats and all of that, as well as embody those core values of the entrepreneurs that have started that business. So that was something that when we talked about how competencies could be used in that case, they immediately resonated with them as a way to really use a tool that could really kind of be picked up fairly simply and used as part of their hiring process.
Absolutely. And again, it's giving you a standardized process, something you can standardize in terms of, we've got this person we're interviewing, this person we're interviewing, we're looking for certain behaviors, and those are the same behaviors we're looking at across candidates.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so there's another question. We've kind of touched on some of this stuff, and I'm not sure, I'm going to throw this to you, Andrea. We'll see if you have some figures for this. What ROI figures should you look for?
I think that's hard to put an actual number to it, because again, as we were talking about earlier, a small win is even a big win, if that makes sense. So even as I said, if you had no client, like none of your employees had development plans in place, and now you had 90% change, that's huge. And you may not be able to put a direct dollar to that per se, but some of those things, or just being able to now have a tool to hire and consistently hire and look at candidates as you're interviewing them, even that, you may not be able to put a dollar amount to that, but it is going to increase the level of caliber of candidates that you're getting, and also you should have better candidates, so speed to productivity and those kinds of things should improve as well.
And as long as you understand what it is you're trying to measure, so you have to set those benchmarks at the beginning. You have to look within your organization, there's a bit of self-reflection maybe in terms of what's going on in the organization. What are those turnover figures?
Exactly.
What are those, whatever they may be? Understand them so that you can go back and measure to demonstrate that return on investment.
And keeping in mind from a pure measurement standpoint, and that's why ROI is often a little challenging, is you've got to show causation, and you often can't do that because there might be other changes going on in your organization, and you can't just throw those to the side. So it's more saying, once we've started to use competencies, we've seen a change in this type of measure.
Okay, so I think I'm seeing one more question coming in here, so we're just going to give it a minute before we sign off. Oh, let's see. How can competencies help in a very specified position?
So again, I think that's where you're going to look at what we would call more of the job-specific competencies.
Absolutely.
So they're getting at that fine level of technical detail you need for that specific job. So we're getting to a point of granularity where we can actually say, these are the specific technical things you need to be doing in your job to be successful. And again, because our competencies have that 5-point scale, you can start to capture progression as you move across, or you basically, improve your expertise in that area.
Cool. I'm seeing somebody typing. We'll see if we get one more question here before we... Oh, no, somebody was just telling us we did a great job, so thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
So we are going to wrap up. We've hit our 20-minute mark, so Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have to fly you back in from Toronto again for a future episode. And thank you all for joining us, taking the time out of your day to watch. If check us out. The recorded sessions will be made available, and come back next month. We'll be back coming to you live, Competency Corner live. Talk to you then.
And happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
And Happy New Year.